The story of Betty Broderick is a haunting tale of love gone wrong, betrayal, and ultimately, murder. It is a case that shocked the nation and highlighted the dark side of marital breakdown, infidelity, and the extreme emotions that can drive a person to commit unthinkable acts. Betty Broderick's story is not just about a woman who killed her ex-husband and his new wife. It is a complex narrative about the unraveling of a life, the destructive power of anger and resentment, and the tragic consequences of a bitter divorce. A picture-perfect marriage. Betty Broderick, born Elizabeth Ann 𝐵𝐸𝐵𝐸 in 1947, appeared to have it all. Raised in a strict Catholic family in Eastchester, New York, she was taught to aspire to a life of domestic bliss. In 1969, she married Daniel T. Broderick III, a medical student at Cornell University. Dan was ambitious and driven, and Betty supported him financially and emotionally, as he pursued both a medical degree and later a law degree at Harvard. During this time, Betty worked multiple jobs and gave birth to 4 children. She was the quintessential supportive wife, doing everything she could to help her husband succeed. By the time Dan finished his education and began his career as a malpractice attorney in San Diego, the Brodericks had achieved the American dream. They lived in a beautiful home in the affluent neighborhood of La Jolla. Their children attended private schools, and they enjoyed all the trappings of wealth and success. To outsiders, they seemed like the perfect family. The unraveling. Despite their outward appearance of success and happiness, the Broderick marriage began to crumble. As Dan's career flourished, Betty noticed changes in his behavior. He became more distant, working long hours and spending less time with his family. Betty suspected that Dan was having an affair, but he denied her accusations. The tension between them grew, and Betty's suspicions only deepened. In 1983, Betty's worst fears were confirmed when she discovered that Dan was indeed having an affair with his legal assistant, 𝐤𝐚𝐭𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐬, a much younger woman. Linda was a 21-year-old former flight attendant with no legal training, but Dan hired her as his assistant. Betty was devastated. The betrayal cut deep, and she felt that everything she had sacrificed for Dan was in vain. The man she had supported through years of education and helped build a successful career had cast her aside for someone younger and more attractive. The discovery of the affair marked the beginning of a bitter and acrimonious divorce that would last 5 years. Betty became consumed with anger and resentment. She saw Dan's actions as a complete betrayal of the life they had built together. Her anger was compounded by the fact that Dan, as a lawyer, had the upper hand in the legal proceedings. He manipulated the divorce process to his advantage, leaving Betty feeling powerless and increasingly desperate. The bitter divorce. The divorce proceedings between Betty and Dan Broderick were brutal. Betty believed Dan used his legal expertise to strip her of everything she cherished: her home, financial security, and most painfully, her children. Dan was awarded primary custody, and Betty was ordered to pay spousal support, a ruling she found deeply humiliating. As the divorce dragged on, Betty's behavior became increasingly erratic. Her frustration and anger led to acts of vandalism and harassment, such as leaving obscene messages on Dan's answering machine, driving her car into his front door, and even throwing a pie at him in court. These desperate actions only further alienated her from her children and deepened her despair. Friends and family watched in horror as Betty, once a loving wife and mother, became consumed by hatred and a desire for revenge, feeling abandoned and betrayed by both her husband and the legal system. The murders. On November 5th, 1989, Betty Broderick reached her breaking point. In the early morning hours, she drove to Dan's home, using a key she had stolen from her daughter. She quietly entered the house and went to the bedroom where Dan and Linda were sleeping. Without hesitation, Betty pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and fired 5 shots, hitting both Dan and Linda. Dan was struck in the chest and back, while Linda was shot in the head and chest. Both died almost instantly. Betty later claimed that she did not plan to kill them, but her actions told a different story. After the murders, she left a message on her daughter's answering machine saying, "I just shot Dad. I don't know where I'm going, but I'm going." Betty turned herself into the police later that day. The trial and conviction. Betty Broderick's trial was a media sensation. The case attracted widespread attention, with many people divided on their views of Betty. Some saw her as a cold-blooded murderer, while others viewed her as a victim of a manipulative husband and a biased legal system. The trial revealed the depths of Betty's anger and resentment, as well as the psychological toll that the divorce had taken on her. Betty's defense team argued that she was driven to murder by years of emotional abuse and manipulation by Dan. They claimed that she was suffering from battered woman syndrome and that the murders were the result of years of pent-up rage and despair. However, the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that Betty had meticulously planned the murders and that her actions were not the result of temporary insanity, but a calculated act of revenge. The jury was tasked with determining whether Betty's actions were premeditated or the result of a momentary loss of control. After a lengthy trial, Betty was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 32 years to life in prison. The aftermath. Betty Broderick's story did not end with her conviction. It continued to captivate the public. Many sympathized with her, viewing her as a woman driven to the edge by an unfaithful husband and a biased legal system, while others saw her as a dangerous, unrepentant criminal. In prison, Betty remained defiant, never expressing remorse and insisting she was the real victim. Her story was dramatized in the popular TV movie A Woman Scorned: The Betty Broderick Story, which further fueled interest in her case. Despite numerous parole hearings, she has been repeatedly denied release due to her lack of remorse and refusal to take responsibility for her actions. A sobering lesson. The case of Betty Broderick is a tragic reminder of how infidelity, betrayal, and a bitter divorce can lead to devastating consequences. It highlights the emotional toll that a contentious divorce can take on individuals and the potential for those emotions to spiral out of control. Betty Broderick's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting anger and resentment consume one's life. In the end, the story of Betty Broderick is not just about murder, it is about the destruction of a family and the irreversible consequences of a broken heart. It is a sobering lesson about the importance of seeking help when faced with overwhelming emotions and the need to find healthy ways to cope with the pain of betrayal. Betty's actions were the result of years of unresolved anger and hurt, and her story is a reminder that the path of revenge only leads to tragedy. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.